Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Our subject is terrorism and what can be done to combat it. And even though it's April 1st, it's hard to make jokes about that. Because shockingly, by far the greatest terrorist campaign in the world today is being conducted by the Obama administration. Not by Al-Qaeda and those associated organizations that the U.S. Congress declared war against 12 years ago. It's part of the U.S. policy pursued by the Obama administration that have plagued the world with war and destruction. Not to protect U.S. citizens, it doesn't do that, but for the profits of the tiny American economic elite, the 1%, who've gotten 95% of the income gains in the Obama years. I'm Carl Estabrook, and it's the 14th week of 2014, another week in which the Obama administration tried to distract Americans from their war-making, which most Americans disapprove of, by hysterical charges against Russian political moves on their own borders. We'll talk about that tonight with commentaries from Ron Zoke, April is the Cruelest Month, Deborah Johnson, U.S. Foreign Policy Blowback, David Johnson, Venezuela and Ukraine, Karen Aram, brief comments on a few things, and a video of Obama's war coming home, the police killing of a homeless man in New Mexico that has led to 2 nights of rioting by a militarized police force. If we take a long view, we can see that U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years. Martin Luther King called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. That's still true when the U.S. spends more on war each year not only than Russia or China, but more than all other countries of the world combined. And the U.S. has almost 1,000 military bases around the world in some 150 of the world's 200 countries. President Obama, who was elected because he promised change, has continued the war-making of his predecessors and simply lied about it, because 3 out of 4 Americans are against it. Obama is carrying out the most extreme global terrorism campaign in the world. The drone campaign is simply a terrorist campaign. It's an assassination campaign. The former head of the CIA, Michael Hayden, recently conceded there isn't a single country in the world that accepts U.S. legal justification for the campaign, except for Israel and Afghanistan. And he's probably wrong about Afghanistan. It's recognized at the highest level that the assassination campaign is simply radicalizing the population and creating more people who want revenge, more people whom we call terrorists. But because of President Obama's intense propaganda and the shameful cooperation of the American media, most Americans don't know the extent of the war that the U.S. has brought to the rest of the world. At our recent anti-war demonstrations in Champaign and Urbana, the most frequently asked questions are, what war? And by those a bit better informed, which war? Aware, our local anti-war group, has been around for a dozen years, since the 9/11 attacks, when a number of people in Champaign-Urbana, like people in local communities around the country, saw that the U.S. government would use the 9/11 crimes as an excuse to carry on and expand its decades-long wars for the control of Middle East energy resources. Our friends also saw that the traditional political parties, Democrat and Republican, would both cave in to the U.S. government's war-making strategy, which remains essentially the same whether Republicans or Democrats are in office. Today, the U.S. government is threatening, invading, occupying, and subverting countries around the world, particularly in a vast circle around the Middle East, which the U.S. military calls, revealingly enough, Central Command. This region has the world's greatest concentration of oil and natural gas, and our government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars, month after month, to control it. Control, and not just access to these energy resources, is what our government demanded for more than 2 generations. We, in fact, import little of our own oil supplies from the Mideast. Most of our imported oil comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of world energy supplies gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. These wars are not in the interest of 99% of Americans, only the 1% who profit from armaments and oil. In other words, President Obama is killing men, women, and children in Asia and Africa in our name because China and other countries need oil, and our government intends to have control over where they get it. The Obama administration has built up what is essentially a private army, the Special Operations Command, engaged in kidnapping, they call it rendition, and assassination around the world. Some 70,000 U.S. troops in SOCOM are active in some 130 countries, according to their spokesman. They report only to the President's National Security Council. These are American death squads, which, along with drones, are the Obama administration's substitute for the ground troops deployed by the Bush administration in invasion and occupation. They produce fewer American casualties, and they keep secret the administration's foreign wars. Not secret, of course, from the victims. Their mission is not fighting terrorism, but rather securing the U.S. worldwide economic empire. The Obama administration is confident these American killers, recruited in the depth of the Great Recession, will not be as politically aware as their foreign counterparts often are. Why is Obama carrying on this secret global assassination campaign when it's obvious that it increases terrorism around the world? We can only conclude, hard as it is to believe, that the U.S. government wants war, even including terrorist attacks against U.S. interests and citizens. If there were no war, the U.S. would have no excuse for occupying the world's greatest energy-producing region. Energy politics are also involved in the U.S. machinations in Ukraine, revealed recently in the overheard phone calls of Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, who was also a member of the Bush and Clinton administrations. All recent administrations worked to extend NATO, the U.S. military alliance, to the borders of Russia, the goal being U.S. economic control in Eastern Europe. Remember Clinton's attack on Serbia 15 years ago as part of the same policy. Obama's problem is the American people, who recently stopped him from bombing Syria and may stop him from U.S. military action in Eastern Europe and South America, about which we'll hear tonight. Americans don't want more war and are suffering from the administration's economic policies. But politicians, bankers, and corporations do want war, so it's clear whom Obama is working for. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to help frustrate the 1%'s war policy as it's put into practice by President Obama. And we'll begin tonight with Ron Zoke. April is the cruelest month.
Yes, that's the opening line from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, recycled by T.S. Eliot. And I'm alluding to, I guess, the weather and general atmosphere of this month, where we are having a relatively benign and warm and sunny day from time to time, and that's followed by another period of bad weather, and it fluctuates badly. So we're getting our hopes up, and then one day, and then dash the next. And that's the way it goes, especially in April. I want to skip over a number of things very lightly today. I'm recovering from a cold, and I'd actually like to talk as little as possible today.
That's not why you're wearing a weather vane, though.
Right. Okay. Once again, the USA is maintaining its status as the largest purveyor of violence around the world. It's so bad that I wonder sometimes if I'm living in a cartoon. I just feel like wandering around and shouting random obscenities like a Tourette's syndrome patient. But anyway,
Here.
Yeah. Aside from all that, the big news this week, other than the disappearing airplane, has still been Russia and stopping Russia, standing up to Putin, and what we should do about their supposed annexation of Crimea. More and more people seem to be advocating military action because those Ruskies only understand force and violence, I guess. And Putin is appearing relatively reasonable about the situation, but the situation keeps getting exaggerated, I think, by the American media and our right-wing commentators who are essentially telling Obama to man up to Putin and show him who's the boss around the world. A number of other subordinate points then. This is crazy. After 2 hearings, an Egyptian court issued death sentence verdict to 529 people in Egypt. The ruling follows the first mass trial of Muslim Brotherhood supporters. The defendants were convicted of attacking a police station in what was a 3-day trial. So will such a mass sentence of death ever be carried out? It's impossible for me to conceive that. Anyway, Obama and allies agreed to exclude Russia from the Group of 8. This is another kiss our behinds move that will accomplish nothing, but I guess it shows how really indignant we are about whatever they've done. The National Association for the Gun Rights is giving away a brand new Colt 6920 AR-15 assault rifle. So you can go to that website and sign up, and you'll be notified if you win the AR-15 assault rifle. The USA has delivered 100 Hellfire missiles to Iraq. Shipment of anti-armor missiles along with assault rifles and bullets will help the anti-terrorism campaign, the U.S. says. I think it will have the opposite effect, but hey. The United States said its delivery was made earlier this month in order to help bolster Iraqi forces fighting a breakaway al-Qaeda group known as the Islamic State of Iran, Iraq, and the Levant. It's essential, they said, that the Iraqi security forces are equipped with modern and effective weaponry given the serious threat the ISIL now poses to Iraq and the region. So the statement also promised to send more weapons to Iraq in the coming weeks. The thing that might be appended to that is BuzzFeed revealed a Pentagon plan to help Yemen develop its own targeted killing program by supplying the country with crop dusting planes armed with laser-guided missiles. As much as you can put a Yemeni face on it, said an American businessman familiar with the plan, it feels better. So there will be a kind of false flag attached to that attack. Endless supply of things here. Before I stop, I wanted to mention that in the past week or two, some very important people have passed on. Jonathan Schell, who's called a crusading author, journalist, and anti-war activist, died at the age of 70. Joseph Weber, the husband of Linda Weber, who has appeared on this program, I believe, from time to time in the past, died at age 90, and we're going to miss him. I want to mention also a special program coming up Thursday and Friday, Breaking Our Bonds with Wall Street. Join us for a special 2-day visit with Thomas Goki. Thursday, April 3rd at 7 p.m. Is it moral to pay back your student loans? And Friday the 4th at noon, Dreaming Beyond the Rolling Jubilee toward a debt strike and global jubilee. So those sound very interesting indeed. And finally, someone is speaking up with the state of indebtedness bondage that a lot of college students are facing at the present time. The U.S. military is averaging more than a mission a day in Africa. The numbers tell the story: 10 exercises, 55 operations, 481 security cooperation activities in Africa. For years, the U.S. military has publicly insisted that its efforts in Africa are small scale. Its public affairs personnel and commanders have repeatedly claimed that no more than a light footprint is on that continent, including a remarkably modest presence when it comes to military personnel. They've, however, balked at saying just how many are there. Last year, AFRICOM Commander General David Rodriguez, the U.S. military, carried out a total of 546 activities on the continent, a catch-all term for everything the military does in Africa. And so on and on. What is this love of, or at least tolerance of, violence in this country and spreading it all around the world? It's become utterly crazy, and I invite your attention to the problem. Georgia guns everywhere law awaits governor's signature. So Georgia has passed a law removing the penalties or the restrictions on carrying guns into churches, schools, and so on. Curiously, it has exempted itself from guns being carried into the legislative chamber in Georgia. Why is that? And so on. This may be a symptom of just how confused and bigoted we are about this whole thing. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron, in spite of the hat. Tell me about those the talks on student debt. Where are they?
Oh, at the University of YMCA.
Okay.
1001 South Wright Street in Champaign, right across the street, Wright Street from Lincoln Hall on the campus.
And the date again?
Oh, Thursday at 7 p.m. On this Thursday, and then again Friday at noon, part of the regular Friday series at the YMCA that goes on for a number of weeks this year.
This is an important issue, not just to students who have these vast debts for their education, debts which now run more than the credit card debt, total credit card debt in the country. Student debt is greater. And the effect of this is to put students essentially into a debt trap, which makes them docile. People have remarked on how strange it is that there was such student interest and concern about America's wars in Southeast Asia a generation ago, and not a parallel interest in America's wars in Southwest Asia today, even though the opposition to those wars was about as great in each case. I mean, by the late 60s, 70% of Americans disapproved of the Vietnam War, and that's about where the percentage is now in disapproval of the wars in the Middle East that the Obama administration is carrying on. But campuses, those of us particularly who've kicked around campuses then and now, no, campuses are very different. How has that happened? Well, one of the major methods, conscious or not, has been the vast load of debt that has been placed upon students. Students are not very much concerned about other things when their biggest problem is to get their degree so they can get a job and find some way to pay off their indebtedness. So this is an important topic, and not just to students. You're watching Aware on the Air. Other comments on Ron's observations here, ladies and gentlemen?
Well, I think a lot of this war stuff is, it's all about money. I mean, and so, you know, they push it because it's profitable. And it's pretty sad that that's where we are, but, you know, it's all about the money.
Follow the money in the famous Watergate
that
phrase.
was a conclusion of General Smedley Butler, the U.S. Marine General, the most decorated military man of his time, who said war is a racket. And that's what he ultimately saw at the bottom of it. And
he was saying that as the U.S. was engaging in the run-up to the Second World War.
Right.
I mean, 1930s. So, yes, plus ça change. We'll go now to Deb Johnson with some remarks on U.S. foreign policy blowback.
All right, well, first I want to just say that it's National Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and so I just want to put that out there. Also, if you get a chance, Chris Hedges gave a wonderful speech. I happened to catch it online last night, I believe. Come Through Rebellion at the One Nation Under Surveillance Conference in Connecticut. It was a wonderful speech, and I highly recommend that you find it online and listen to it. I have an article here that I'd like to read. It came from Common Dreams, and it was published on Friday, March 21st, and it's called U.S. Foreign Policy Blowback, How U.S. Disregard for International Law Set the Stage for the Crimean Crisis, written by John Quealy. 11 years ago this week, the U.S. decided to sidestep international law in its rush to invade the sovereign nation of Iraq. In doing so, charged critics, that has helped open a Pandora's box of imperial lawlessness that is now rearing its head in Ukraine. Amid warnings that what's taking place as Russia battles the U.S. and European nations over a new government in Kiev, and Crimea's vote to officially secede from Ukraine is the beginning of a new Cold War, many observers have called out Western hypocrisy when it comes to the White House and Downing Street pointing fingers at the Kremlin. And I'll quote Randall Amster from Georgetown University: in an era in which exceptionalism has become the norm, where the cavalier disregard of domestic and or global objections is considered politically acceptable, and where powerful nations can exercise a free hand in determining the future of less powerful ones when strategic interests are involved, unquote. Taking that point further, on Thursday, Randall, director of the program on justice and peace at Georgetown University, argues in a piece at Common Dreams that despite all the rhetoric, sanctions, and threats of further punishment coming from Washington, the missing analysis about Ukraine is how it represents a kind of foreign policy blowback resulting from the U.S.-led wars and interventions of recent years in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Amster points out that by ignoring international law when it suited their own interests, the U.S. and U.K. set the stage for others, at least those with the requisite military and political might, to follow suit. Quote, as many pointed out at the time, the invasion of Iraq in particular foretold a world racked by disregard for international norms and defined by the mercenary pursuits of national self-interest. In setting a template for the policy engagements to follow, this archetype of adventurism ushered in an era which exceptionalism has become the norm, where the cavalier disregard of domestic and or global objections is considered politically acceptable, and where powerful nations can exercise a free hand in determining the future of less powerful ones when strategic interests are involved. It would be hard to conceive of a more pointed version of realpolitik, and the term is doubly poignant in light of the outcomes we are seeing today. Russia's rhetorical reliance on misguided Western policies does little more than render concrete that which has already been known and deployed by powerful interests for decades, if not longer. But the invocation of recent U.S.-led forays in the specific use of the word exceptionalism in Russian discourse add a dimension that is deeply troubling for the future prospects of peace. By making realpolitik more, well, real, the annexation of Crimea is less likely to draw a military response from the West than it is to elicit wider forms of emulation. In abdicating their already tenuous hold on moral legitimacy in international affairs, the U.S. and its allies have eroded one of the last potential bastions against the imminent realization of a world dominated by strategic resource acquisition as a function of security. In an editorial by The Nation posted Wednesday, the magazine's editors also invoke U.S. transgressions in the context of Ukraine. quote, yes, Vladimir Putin's annexation of Crimea trespasses on international law, unquote, they write, but it's, quote, difficult to bear U.S. officials' invocation of a principle that Washington itself has often violated. And in quotation, in parentheses, see, most recently, Kosovo and Iraq, the latter now marking the 11th anniversary of an illegal U.S. invasion and occupation. An author and historian, Howard Friel, also at Common Dreams, defies the Western media's dominant anti-Putin line, not to defend Russian motives or actions, but to cast a light on U.S. violations that now make it impossible for Washington to stand as a moral authority on issues of international law. In a string of rhetorical questions, Friel asks, did Putin invade Iraq and destroy that society? Did Putin lie to the American people about the reasons for that invasion? Did Putin kill 1 million Iraqis? Did Putin spend $1 trillion of the Americans' public money on the Iraq invasion? Did Putin invade Afghanistan? Did he spend $700 billion on the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan? Does Putin have a kill list to murder suspected terrorists without due process and outside any field of battle? According to the Nation editors, the only thing that can now resolve this crisis in Ukraine and brewing Cold War redux between Russia and the Western powers is a true and meaningful focus on diplomacy. Threats of military escalation must be averted, they say, and, quote, war parties, unquote, on all sides must be pushed aside in the name of a peaceful agreement going forward. And while Amster agrees that a negotiated settlement should also be the focus, he argues strongly that time should be spent reflecting on how previous examples of cast-off international obligations, now the modus operandi of powerful interests across the globe, have brought us to this point. And I think that was just such a powerful article. And I just want to end with a quote from Woody Allen, of all people. I felt much better when I gave up on hope. No fool, no joke.
Thank you, Deb. Appreciate that. Comments, ladies and gentlemen?
Yeah, I think the U.S. is a bad example for a lot of things around the world, and all this pious talk about international law and so on, at the same time that we're constantly violating it ourselves, and all the talk about American exceptionalism, as if the rules that should apply to the rest of the world don't really apply to us somehow. It's been implicit in the talk about Israel for a long time. It's another exception, yes, apparently. And so Russia and other countries are picking up the same line. Well, we too are an exception, and we don't follow anyone else's principles. We're unique, and we'll keep it that way. And incidentally, they are also developing their own drones and targeted attack vehicles for the assassination of people that they don't like. Any scientific or technical development like that is only temporarily an advantage. They will eventually be found out by other people, as we learned about the atomic and then hydrogen bombs. And once the precedent has been set, then they will use it in their own self-interest.
Well, excuse me, my only comment on this in reference to what is happening in the Ukraine is that the Crimea is made up of primarily Russian speakers. So while I was opposed to the intervention, we'll call it an intervention by Russia, according to a lot of the international observers, the elections were fair. You had a 90% turnout, and out of that, I don't quote me on the figures, but out of, I think, close to 90% turnout, I think it was something like 86% in favor. You could correct me on that, but it was that close in favor of going with Russia, as opposed to the EU. And that's my point. Pepe Escobar, a well-known journalist, has made it very clear from his perspective on some of his articles that it's not about the EU, it's about NATO. That's why the U.S. has been pushing and why they want the Ukraine in NATO. And even the EU now, I mean, they have so much, they have so much debt. They don't really want the Ukraine in the EU because of the debt that the Ukraine has. So now, of course, we, along with the EU, I think we've proposed something like $1 billion, a mere $1 billion out of taxpayers' money to help bail out the Ukraine, which, Russia offered the Crimea, that they would bail them out or do away with their debt. In any event, according to Pepe, one of the things that's going to come out of all of this is that the EU is not going to want the Ukraine because of their debt, and we're pushing Russia closer to China. In fact, I think as of May 1st, there's going to be a meeting. I think, if not Putin, I think it's the foreign minister or someone is going to be meeting in Beijing. They're looking at Gazprom because this is about the gas. It goes through the Ukraine, the pipelines, and China's the one who's going to benefit from all of this. But I also want to quote Tariq Ali. He's another well-known journalist. I think he's of Pakistan origin, from the left. He pointed out that Secretary James Baker, when he met with Gorbachev during the Reagan administration, they agreed that NATO would not spread east. NATO was supposed to be a Cold War instrument. But Yeltsin did whatever the U.S. wanted. Yeltsin did all of the U.S. bidding. And now the U.S. is very unhappy with Putin because Putin is a very strong leader and he does not do U.S. bidding. We also have to look at the parameters, all of the nuclear arsenals that are surrounding that whole area and how dangerous it is. And a lot of journalists and commentators have said, well, how would we feel, or how did we feel during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Would we want a missile buildup on our near our borders? So I think we have to look at what the future holds. Another real danger is the EU now accepts the fact that the spread of Nazism in the Ukraine may not be stopped. It's probably beyond stopping it. So we are looking at real problems economically. I don't believe the U.S. wants war, but as Mr. Noam Chomsky has said many times, you don't flirt with it. You don't flirt with it. You don't try to entertain it because anything could happen at any time. So it is a very dangerous situation. But China's going to reap the benefits, I think, from this.
Thank you, Karen. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We'll go to David Johnson for some comments on Venezuela and also Ukraine.
Okay, well, Karen, you spoke a lot of the things I was going to mention about Ukraine, and I guess that's a good thing. It saves me some effort, but it just amazes me. I mean, the hypocrisy. I mean, the words coming out of the mouths of Barack Obama and John Kerry, talking about interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. Are you kidding me? I mean, do they think that the American people have absolutely zero memory? It's just astounding. And what's all equally astounding is the people that control our government, not the American people, but the people who control our government, the 1%. I mean, are pushing us to world extinction. I mean, this is not hyperbole. I mean, you look at what they're doing to the environment, and now with this thing with Russia, I mean, this is just craziness. And I mean, the American people don't support this, but the 1% don't care what we think. I mean, granted, the politicians have to occasionally, but the 1% are just going to keep pursuing this reckless course to earn more and more money. It's almost like a drug addict that just throws reason aside to get another fix. I mean, I don't know any other analogy for it. The whole thing with Crimea, as Karen pointed out, is that, well, let's go back a little bit. This whole thing with Ukraine, $5 billion of our tax money was given to certain groups in the Ukraine to destabilize that country. $5 billion. I mean, think about what we could have done with that money here in the United States. They're talking about cutting Social Security, want to cut Medicare because they say it's too expensive. They say we can't afford a Medicare for all health care system, and we can't fund our public schools, and we can't afford to have free college education for our young people, and we can't afford to have high-speed trains. I mean, why? I mean, this is $5 billion going to groups in the Ukraine, as Karen pointed out, are neo-Nazis. I mean, of course, not all the groups that received the money were. However, many of the groups, the neoliberals, of course, made a convenient alliance with the Nazis for now to destabilize things. And, you know, some people may say, well, this is the will of the Ukrainian people. I mean, just because there's a bunch of money thrown around doesn't necessarily mean that's the whole source of, you know, what's happened there. Well, the thing is that this has a lot of different historical examples. This sort of thing's happened before, going back to 1953, when Iran had a democratically elected government. And the Iranian people, the president of Iran at that time, Mossadegh, did the will of the Iranian people, and they wanted a larger percentage of the oil revenues that was being controlled by mainly British oil companies. And as a result of that, the British and the United States formed an alliance and basically pumped a bunch of money into, first they bribed off military officials, then they hired common criminals and organized crime to go out and start riots, and they started a whole bunch of destabilization campaigns that eventually provoked the military to take over. They basically, arrested the elected president and brought back the Shah of Iran, the son of the original Shah, and imposed him into power, which after that, an almost 30-year reign of terror occurred. But hey, I guess it was worth it to them because they got their oil revenues back. This is the whole bottom line of this. It's not, the foreign policy of this government in the last 50 years has not been in the interest of the American people. It's been in the interest of the earnings of the 1% in the special corporate special interests. And this is the problem, and it's gotten out of control. And this recent incident with Ukraine, I mean, is a perfect example of that. There's other things too. I mean, there's other historical examples of these destabilization campaigns. You had Chile in 1973, very similar playbook as what happened in Iran. And then more recently in Yugoslavia during the 1990s, first with Croatia and then other Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, that broke up this country that because the corporate interests did not want a threat of a good example, because Yugoslavia was a state-based economy with a market, somewhat of a market, but it was actually a fairly productive and economically healthy non-market economy. There was a non-capitalist country that was very independent during the Cold War and was neutral, but they couldn't allow this to continue. And this is, it seemed like it was perfectly fine for all these breakaway provinces forming their own, taking votes and forming their own countries then in Yugoslavia, but all of a sudden, as Karen pointed out, in the midst of all this turmoil going on in the Ukraine and attacks on Russian-speaking people that were a minority in the western part of the Ukraine, it would only seem logical that the Crimea, which is predominantly Russian-speaking, felt insecure from these attacks that were happening in the east and looked like in the west that were spreading east. So, I mean, it seems only natural that the Crimean people wanted to federate with Russia, took a vote, and that should be the end of the things. And but it's just amazing how they make such a big deal out of this, as if this was some kind of great violation of international law. But nevertheless, I guess the point is we got to keep in mind that despite all the lies of the corporate media, we got to look at what has been past practice. That's the key here. Look at who's saying it, what are they saying, and what have they done in the past. Of course, they're like analyzing a crime. Look at the criminals, see what their past MO, method operation is, to get a fairly good idea of what's really going on.
And don't expect to get the truth off of corporate media. You've got to go to independent news sites on the web, because you are not going to get any truth. They're going to present to you the version they want you to believe.
Yes, and that's amazing. I mean, they talk about, you know, first of all, as Carl's pointed out many times, you know, the people in the former Soviet Union knew that Pravda was basically a propaganda newspaper. And, you know, it's more and more Americans are starting to realize that the corporate media in this country is not actually practicing journalism. They're basically just a propaganda organ of the corporate state.
That's exactly right.
And they're worldwide. Unfortunately, I was in Turkey for about a week and then in Barcelona for almost a week. And the whole time, the only English language news that I received was when I was in Turkey, and of course it was CNN International. And the whole time, all they focused on was the Malaysian airline crash. And then I come back to Chicago, all I could get was focus on the Malaysian airline crash. Then I'm here, and even right up until this morning before I came in, I click on CNN. I don't watch it. I watch Democracy Now! And I also watch RT. It was about the Malaysian airline crash. And what bothered me when I was in Europe was the fact that it was being painted as a hostage crisis or a terrorist attack on the U.S. And I kept asking myself, how could this be a terrorist attack on the U.S. when only 12 people on the plane out of something like 229 were non-Chinese nationals? And yet, again, by the time I reached Chicago, there was an interview on CNN with the partner of one of the Americans who had gone missing on the plane. And she kept talking about this issue as if it was a terrorist attack, and she knew that they were being held somewhere hostage. And I thought, why are they interviewing her? Why are they portraying this? And she actually compared it to 9/11. I kid you not.
Well, that's because
sure
I think
enough, the next day, Cooper Anderson chose to interview her as well.
Oh, man.
I couldn't believe it.
And my question is, I wonder if she was prompted, you know, I mean.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Not
it's
by the
possible.
corporate media, but basically the journalists that came to interview. Do you think there might be a possibility that your loved one, you know, is a hostage and being held? I mean, it's
don't
just
know.
amazing.
It's a fear factor. They
Oh,
have to
absolutely.
push the fear factor.
Yeah.
Or how legitimate are these wars that they keep starting? You know, we have to be afraid so that we then will, you know, agree or go along with whatever craziness they decide to do next. I
Yes.
mean, it's pretty pathetic.
Fear, lies, and distractions.
Yeah.
And the Malaysia, I mean, it seems like it's a twofold thing with the Malaysian airliner. On the one hand, it's a distraction
It is,
to keep
definitely.
you
Right.
unfocused from what other things are
Yes,
going on, both here in the
exactly.
United States and
Yeah.
abroad.
right.
And then trying to, you know, when you can't ignore it, or in a combination with that, to try to say, you know, oh, this could be another terrorist attack. Be afraid, be very afraid. Surrender all your civil liberties, surrender all your rights. Let us handle this, and you know,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's important to be able to winnow out of the wacko stuff something that is interesting, possibly, and important. I mean, I've seen some things. Here's another headline from Educate Yourself, the Freedom of Knowledge, the Power of Thought. Shocker, Putin, like Lenin and Soviet Bolshevism, is an agent of Zionist Jewry.
Oh, God.
What? This is crazy stuff that's circulating. But the more interesting thing was that this morning, the Ukrainian government, which is not legitimate, anyway,
Yes,
is
exactly.
Right, that one is
That
not
one is not
legitimate.
legitimate.
Exactly.
is proceeding against the so-called nationalist and ultra-nationalist groups that are in Kiev. And they have their own militias, and the word is they have to be stopped now. And of course, that's just an oblique way of saying that they are actually fascist groups.
After they used them for their own purposes.
Yes,
of course.
yes.
I mean, there's a similar parallel to in Germany right after the First World War, when the liberals there were happy to use the Freikorps, which was a pre-Nazi militia group. Of course, once they got the job done and got rid of those pesky labor unions and leftists, of course, they proceeded to move against the Freikorps. What's interesting, have anybody heard anything credible, that is? I've just heard little bits and pieces that in a lot of this turmoil, these attacks and violence going on with these right-wing groups in Ukraine, that supposedly there was reports of a fair number of Israeli Mossad agents involved in this destabilization campaign. Is there any credibility to this that anyone knows?
It's hard to believe that.
I mean, politics makes strange bedfellows, granted,
yeah.
but it's.
But we know that the U.S., literally for generations, has used Israel often in places where the U.S. wanted to subvert governments and keep its cover. When the Reagan administration, for example, was trying to overthrow governments in Central America, they used Israeli assets because American foreign policy essentially had been driven underground. The Reagan administration knew that to do this openly would be unpopular in the U.S., and that what they called the Vietnam syndrome, which meant the American public's opposition to American war making, and so they used others. The Contra War in Nicaragua and was preceded by the use of Israeli mercenaries, really, in Guatemala. This is not an isolated case, and the reports of Israeli military and paramilitary groups active in Ukraine are difficult to deny, it seems to me. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a few minutes left here for some other comments. Karen?
Yeah, actually, I want to ask a question, but I have to lead up to it. When I was in Barcelona, I met with only one person who was Catalonian. If for people who aren't aware, I know you all are, Catalonians were the people of Barcelona that were the first group of anarcho-syndicalists in the 30s that fought the Franco regime and set up some of the first communes and collectivization. They failed, but they made the attempt. So they have a strong history of resistance. And I was told that they are going to have a referendum on November 9th to secede from the rest of Spain because they're tired of paying for the government. Also because of the EU impositions or the EU, the IMF have imposed upon them, such as austerity, joblessness, cutting their pensions, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and actually, it started taking place, I think, over the weekend. And I've posted on Facebook that thousands not only were in Madrid, but thousands are in Barcelona. And this is fine. I also know it's fine to me because I like seeing the people rise up against oppression. And that's why I also posted on Facebook last night Chris Hedges' speech that you referred to, Deb. Other cities as well, Venice, I think Sicily, I don't know much about Sicily, but Venice and other nations.
Sardinia. Sicily, but, yeah.
Okay, Sardinia, okay. Other cities are now looking to do the same thing, to succeed. But these are...
Scotland too, eh?
Scotland, exactly, from the UK. These are generally prosperous cities. So while I see their point and I see all the pros of withdrawing from the EU and therefore NATO, I see the pros in favor of it. I have to ask myself if this really is an answer to solving the problem. Example, Silicon Valley. We know California is one of the largest money earners, okay, profit-making centers of the United States. What if California was to decide to secede from the Union? I mean,
A lot of people would say goodbye.
yes, I know, but at the same time, so I asked the question of all of you here, if you have any opinions on this, what would be the outcome? In other words, it sounds positive to rise up against governments, but at the same time, I wonder if it isn't a rather selfish endeavor on the part of these cities that are successful and prosperous to do that to the rest of their nation. So that's my question, if anyone has any opinions on this.
It's an interesting question in that these various independence movements often have a variety of politics behind them and a variety of groups who support them for whatever reasons. Groups from the right and the left, as we say in our rather inadequate way of characterizing political groups. But the general tendency is certainly clear. There does seem to be a question about the the pervasiveness of the nation-state form and the suggestion in each of these cases that something new should be thought about. That's certainly, as Tariq Ali, whom you quoted a few minutes ago, has argued in the case of Scotland, that's an occasion to think about what sort of social organization you do want if you're having this sort of political rearrangement. I mean, after all, we did that in this country in 1776, and it's hard to distinguish what the U.S., what the British colonies in North America did then from what some of these other groups are doing, with the possible difference in the passage of time. But to try to understand what's actually happening, whose interests are being served, and what then should be supported, that's difficult. You mentioned the example both of Yugoslavia and Serbia, where the U.S. and its agents in Europe worked strenuously to suppress governments that were indeed being successful in non-neoliberal economic structures. So these issues should be back on the table. They're very much on the table for our rulers, and to put them onto the table, have a real discussion about those issues in these questions of separateness seems to me to be a very good idea indeed. And there's a history here. That's what we forget. I mean, there's a vast history. Your mention of Catalonia makes me think of the influence of George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia as an account of what the political situation actually was in the Spanish Civil War, which for most Americans is absolutely unknown. We've said for a while here that we should run a program specifically devoted to war and political literature of the last several generations, and that book would certainly be on the list. So we may think about that possibility and come up with some suggestions.
Briefly, I just want to say, it seems to me that we are definitely becoming a surveillance state, and I think because of the fact that we push this this shock doctrine, if you want to call it that, to these countries where they're loaned all this money, and then the masses end up penniless at the end. It seems to me that the answer to that is the surveillance state, and a lot of gated communities, and fortressing the 1% up, so they don't have to deal with the less fortunate. And
Problems they created.
It's kind of sad because there is such a companies are making so much money, especially in Israel, of weapons and security, and you look on the stock exchange in Israel, and I mean those companies are just making a killing, no pun intended. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It seems that the surveillance state is here, and
well, that was Naomi Klein's thesis for the future in her shock doctrine of, I think it was 2007, 2008, and it's already here. Yeah, it's already here.
I thought there was some irony this week in the Obama administration proposing to release the convicted Israeli spy, Jonathan Pollard, in a deal with the Israeli government in order to get the Israeli government to do a few of the things that the Obama administration would like. At the same time, of course, Edward Snowden remains
exile.
An exile, precisely, the very word. And the Obama administration is making sure that this particular spy, who revealed things that we didn't want revealed, that he indeed would remain on the run. So, there's plenty of hypocrisy to go around.
Yeah, let's not forget Julian Assange, still held up in the Ecuadorian embassy for going on 2 years now.
Oh my God, he's still there. I've forgotten about him.
Yeah, in the background of all this for me is the notion of sovereignty and all these breakaway movements apparently wanting to escape the sovereignty of some larger unit or whatever. And this is a kind of mysterious notion to me. Who has it? What does it mean? What do they do with it? And I'm deeply suspicious about the whole thing, the notion of sovereignty, which seems to mean that there's no higher authority for anything. And I don't believe really in the idea of sovereignty, which makes me, I guess, a kind of political atheist, but
Well,
that's another matter.
Ron, that was the opinion I was looking for, because that my gut reaction is exactly the same thing. I can understand they're wanting that, but I don't think it's the answer.
Yeah.
I really don't.
To conclude with one thing that you might want to think about doing in reaction to some of the things we've been talking about this evening, I'll recommend a group called Roots Actions, Roots, R-O-O-T-S, as in grassroots, Roots Action, it's all one word, .org. If you go to their website, you'll find the following. We'd like to be able to applaud the U.S. State Department for condemning the Egyptian government's decision to murder over 500 people without having to choke on the fact that the U.S. government has been killing thousands of people with drones, many of them civilians. The estimate is that Obama has killed 5,000 civilians with drones. The U.S. doesn't say that, but groups that are monitoring what they're actually doing with the secret program suggest that. Not to mention giving massive supplies of weapons to the abusive Egyptian government that the U.S. is condemning. We'd love it if we could cheer for the U.S. government's denunciations of Russian belligerence in the Ukraine without the oppressive weight of the string of illegal U.S. wars stretching from Afghanistan through Iraq to Libya and the drone wars in Yemen and Pakistan, not to mention the NATO expansion and State Department interference in the Ukraine that has escalated tensions. They're being gentle there, escalated tensions. You could be yes, stronger. Join the anti-hypocrisy movement now, says the Roots Action folks. What they mean is call upon our government to practice what it preaches, so to speak, and you can add your name to the petition that the Roots Action people are putting together on these matters, many of which we've discussed here this evening. You've been watching Aware on the Air. Presented by members and friends of the Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 14th week of 2014. It's what White House aides call Terror Tuesday, by the way, although they're not talking about it much these days. It's the day each week, and apparently it's still going on, when President Obama picks out some people to be murdered by drones or U.S. death squads, the U.S. Joint Operations Command. The president's underlings, notably CIA Director John Brennan, compiles a list of who should be executed, and the president then chooses from baseball cards that are presented to him with these names on them from around the world. The president chooses himself who will die. As I say, the death toll is about 5,000 right now. The assassinations are carried out in secrecy. The administration doesn't release accounts of the people they kill. Literally thousands of men and women and children, some 200, have been killed on Obama's orders. And the source of this, by the way, is not, of course, some lefty commentator someplace. This is the account that the Obama administration gave to the New York Times last year about how it was now fighting the war on terror. Most Americans still don't know that the U.S. is running this terrorist program, but it is being done in your name by a government that has convinced many Americans that they are withdrawing from the Middle East. There are other activities that AWARE carries on around town. We'll tell you about them in future. Members and friends of AWARE are also invited to sit in on this panel with us and participate in this program. We record at noon on Tuesdays in the Urbana City Building. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aaron, Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, Deb Johnson, other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.